It is 5 o'clock. I'd like to call the public hearing to order, please. If you would stand for a moment of silence, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you and welcome everyone. Turn it over to Mr. Klein with Klein & Associates, our TIF consultant, and then we'll let Steve make a presentation and we'll stay and answer as many questions as you may have. Go ahead, Steve. Welcome.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay if I speak louder and project? I think I met most of you as you came in. There's a sign-in sheet. If I missed anyone, maybe I'll ask Stephanie to sign in too.
Thank you.
We appreciate it. This is a public hearing for a proposed amendment to an existing TIF district. It's called TIF District Number 2 here in Peoria Heights. And
Steve, would you mind using the microphone? Because we're recording this so people at home can watch, and that way they can hear what you say. Thank you.
All right. You know me, I like to move around those. So this is a public hearing for the proposed amendment to Peoria Heights TIF District Number 2. And it's a part of the statutory procedure that the village is required to follow to have a public hearing to communicate with you folks as to its intentions and why the amendment's being undertaken, and to answer any questions that you may have about TIF in general and the future use of this particular district, assuming most of you either live in it or adjacent to it. I'll take just a few minutes here at the beginning. What I thought I would do is familiarize you with the area that we're looking at, and then I'll speak a little bit to the number of properties and the types of things that we anticipate will occur within this area. And then I'd like to take a little bit of time to kind of go back, and for those of you who may be less familiar with tax increment financing, we'll try to do a very brief overview of how it works and kind of what it looks like on your tax bill and that type of thing. So if you have questions, though, I would encourage you to go ahead and interrupt me as we go along. If you have questions, just raise your hand and I'll be happy to try to address whatever you'd like to ask. So if you look on everyone should have a handout, and there's a 4-page brochure that we've distributed to you. And the first couple of pages of this, along with the map, would have been included in a mailing if you had gotten a notice of the hearing. So that, you don't have to read that again if you've already looked at that. The third page is new. We'll look at that here in just a couple of minutes. The map on the back is where I'd like to begin. And essentially, if you're looking at this map here, the green shaded area, which would be to the west, bordering along North Boulevard Avenue or Wisconsin Avenue, depending on which side of War Memorial you're on. That green shaded area then extending eastward on both sides adjacent to Memorial, as far over as North Central Avenue, which on the north side of 150 would be the corner of Monroe and US 150. That green area is the original TIF District Number 2 that the village established in 2015. In 2015, that area was created as a redevelopment project area to try to attract new investment, principally for commercial development to occur there. And when the TIF district was established, it was established as a 23-year program. It's a 23-year project. So the final year for the TIF district will be for real estate tax year 2038 payable 2039 because of the one-year lag in real estate taxes when things are assessed and when bills are paid. The timeline for the life of a TIF district runs for 23 years with the final dollars collected in the TIF in the 24th year. And again, I'll get to how that works here in a moment. So effectively, as of 2019, there's 20 years remaining within this designated area, this TIF district. Then over the course of the last, really the last 12 to 18 months, there have been a number of things occurring in the Heights, all good things really with regard to the types of development that is happening here. But one of the things that the village took note of and is aware of happening is that as a lot of improvements and development occurs more uptown here along and adjacent to Prospect Road, it was beginning to create some displacement of existing businesses. They were going to be having to leave their current location because of new development occurring in those spots, and the village really wants to try to retain all of the businesses that it has. One of our fundamental policies here in Peoria Heights, as in most of the communities that I work with, they want to try to work with and treat the ones that are here at least as well as any new developers or projects that we're trying to invite from other places to come here. So we wanted to try to make sure that we had a mechanism here to facilitate the relocation of some of these businesses, not the least of which is the Subway restaurant, which is in an area you're familiar with in front of Trefsker's that eventually is going to need to relocate. They looked for alternative sites within the community, and really not anything that we had to do with, but the owner of that Subway franchise found a location that they would be willing to relocate to if the owner of that property would make some improvements, including adding on or building a new building to house the restaurant. That property, when you're looking at the map, is on the northeast corner of US 150 and Monroe, okay? It was just outside of the original TIF district boundary. And that was the initial impetus for why the village began talking about amending the area, making it larger, including some other properties, was to be able to include that property and some other commercial property along War Memorial Drive that the village felt could possibly either expand or host some of these other relocating businesses. In order to include that property, a TIF district has to have a contiguous boundary. So the perimeter boundary has to be one contiguous line, one boundary that is not divided. You can't have part of the area on one side of town and another part on the other side. It all has to be one contiguous boundary. And contiguity, for our purposes, is not less than about 300 feet. So we can't run a little strip along a road and connect to two bigger areas. We have to have a meaningful connection. So we knew that we were going to need to include some other areas around that site at the corner of Monroe and War to just be able to include it. As the discussion progressed then over the next several weeks, this is over the past year or so, and then we learned that McDonald's was contemplating a complete renovation remodel of their store, which they have now done. And along with that, there are some other things that we would like to work with that property on to try to alleviate some of the traffic congestion that occurs as traffic is trying to pull into McDonald's off of North Prospect Road. And so we're looking forward to, at some point, perhaps when this is completed, we'd like to re-engage that area to look at how we might be able to alleviate some of the traffic congestion that occurs there at times. When we got to the point where the village was looking at extending this across to North Prospect Road, then looking at the map of the community overall, we saw that we were not very far from the tan area up to the north here, which represents the south edge or south border of what's known as Peoria Heights TIF District Number 1. So, and along Prospect Road, of course, is another commercial corridor. It's an important commercial corridor for the community. It's as important to Peoria Heights as is the north part of Prospect Road, where we've been spending a lot of attention and trying to pour in, our efforts to attract new investment up here. So we're trying to look at expanding the TIF area to try to include more of the commercial corridor that extends on down to War Memorial Drive, so that they have an opportunity to benefit from this tool as much as the ones that are north of Lake Street and on up this way. When we got to that point, so you can see this is a progressive thing that's happened over several months, that discussion then moved more toward making sure that we had an area that would qualify, because even adding property to an existing TIF area, we have to make sure that the characteristics of the properties are such that the village can make reasonable findings that the area can benefit by being included in the TIF area. And so we began undertaking a study to look at the North Prospect corridor and the US 150 corridor. So we have that kind of backward L shape that we began working with. And over the course of time there, when we began looking at this boundary, we had a discussion then with the school district because the village has had a long-standing relationship with the school district with regard to the creation and formation of these TIF districts, and that we want to collaborate with them to do things that we feel will not only help bring about economic development, but it will also be a win and help the school district by our being able to attract population, to be able to attract families with kids that will attend the school and do things that will be helpful to the school district as well. And as part of that discussion then, the concept of using tax increment financing for purposes of trying to encourage improvements and redevelopment of existing neighborhood, not replacing what's here, but working with the homes and the properties that are within this area to see if we can't create some type of innovative approach to use tax increment financing to encourage new reinvestment in these properties, so that we can take some of the older homes that exist in these areas, and if they need to add on additional square footage to the house to make it more comfortable for a family to live there. Some of the older turn of the last century bungalows are pretty small, and it's difficult at times to attract families at a reasonable price point to want to live in the Heights. So we want to try to use tax increment financing to the extent possible to create some matching grants, low interest loans, the types of programs then that would encourage people to reinvest in their properties and let the TIF district, to the extent it can, help underwrite some portion of those improvements in the area to make the Heights more attractive for middle income families to want to locate here, or help the ones that are already here expand what they have. In doing that, then, we needed a reasonable amount of neighborhood to really work with and develop a pilot program around. And it is never easy to just determine where the boundary should be, but rather than trying to run the boundary between the middle of blocks or running up alleys or whatever, we decided that because the village boundary begins at the center line of North Prospect Road, and we need 300 feet at least to have our contiguous boundary, that we would just extend this on over to the west right-of-way line of Atlantic Avenue. And we did the same on the south there by extending it to be even across there with the north right-of-way of East Division Avenue. There isn't anything any more scientific than that as to why that boundary is drawn the way it is, except that the school district and the village decided that we want to try this. We want to see if we can make an impact in this part, in these neighborhoods, using TIF and another tool I'll mention here in a moment, to try to see if that works and we can actually make some kind of a positive impact happen over the next few years. If that works, then it's possible that later on additional area could be, some area could be removed after it's been improved from the existing TIF, and some other area could be added later, and we could replicate the program. But we got to create it first, and we got to see if it will actually perform the way that we hope that it will. And so this yellow area is the area that we're proposing to add to TIF District 2 to make that work. Now, with TIF District 2 then being contiguous with TIF District number 1, the village will also then have the ability to more efficiently manage these redevelopment project areas because funds can be utilized from one TIF district to the other in some cases and back and forth. So even though they're on different schedules, they have different lives, they were created, TIF 3 is up in this area, it's farther north yet, but they're all three now contiguous with one another after this amendment is completed, and that will allow the village to use this tool more efficiently, more effectively to try to bring about the improvements and the development that it hopes to find in the future here. The program that I'm referring to for residential development is not something that anyone would have to do. No one's required to do anything with their property. No one is being asked to sell their property for any purpose. The TIF amendment, the amendment to the plan, actually has language in it that indicates the village will not use the findings of the qualifications of the area for purposes of any kind of eminent domain or any kind of taking like that. This is all voluntary. We're trying to create a tool here that residents can benefit from. But the other thing that the village has done recently, as recent as last month actually, was to also establish what's called a business development district. And we won't spend a lot of time talking about that tonight, but the boundary for the business development district, the second one that the village has created, essentially overlays the TIF District 2 boundary. It's for all practical purposes, it's the same line, same boundary. What the business development district does is it allows the village to impose up to 1% additional municipal sales tax on retail trade occurring within that area. And a portion of that new sales tax money can be used by the village, could be, once we put the program together, to supplement this housing redevelopment project that we want to try to create. And so we're envisioning that there could be a combination of some TIF funds and some business development district funds pooled together to be able to make yet a stronger program to try to further encourage new development to occur, redevelopment to occur in that area. The original TIF district boundary, as of this year, has 98 individual parcels in it. We are adding 290 parcels altogether, individual pieces of land or properties. There'll be 388 properties altogether in TIF District number 2 when this amendment is finished. And the area overall that we're adding of those 290 properties, the overall qualification of the area is just beyond 91%. So 91% of the properties within the yellow shaded area exhibited sufficient characteristics to justify their being included in a TIF district. It doesn't mean that your property is blighted or ugly or determined to be in terrible disrepair, but the TIF Act has specific kinds of things that the village looks at with regard to determining the extent to which properties can qualify to be within the TIF boundary, such as the deterioration or the lack of a sidewalk, the deterioration of curb and streets, the lack of adequate stormwater facilities. Perhaps in some cases we have deteriorated alleys, or we have other public infrastructure that needs to be improved. That all helps contribute towards the qualifications of the area. On a property-by-property basis, yes, we looked at each individual property from the road. We don't enter anyone's property, but we look at, is it a house, is it a commercial property? We try to estimate the age of the property and the overall condition with regard to any deterioration that may be visible with regard to either the building or, again, sidewalks, porches, roofs, chimneys, all those types of things we look at. It takes some time to do this, but the village did a thorough job of collecting the information, and it's all documented in the amendment document for the plan. On September 11th of this year, the village hosted what's called a joint review board meeting. All of the overlapping taxing districts, school district, county, township, library district, village, all of them that appear on your tax bill received an invitation, a notice by certified mail of that meeting, and that gave them an opportunity to come and listen to what the village's proposal is and ask questions about the TIF district. That meeting was held. Not all of the taxing bodies attended or chose to attend. Some did. But the advisory recommendation coming out of the meeting was for the village to proceed with the amendment. Now, anyone have any questions? Let me pause there for a moment on the boundary or the purpose for the TIF area. Yes, sir, in the back.
Well, I'm just looking at this map here, and I listened to what you said, and I was actually looking at this whole North Monroe Avenue thing there, and I'm kind of curious why you didn't just square the whole thing off to North Monroe and just make that all one big block.
Stephen, just for everyone that will be watching at home, would you repeat the question, please, before you give the answer?
Yes. So the gentleman asked a question as to, with regard to the boundary as shown here, why it did not include the blocks that would extend north of and adjacent to Monroe Avenue. Close enough? Is that okay? And as I said earlier, there wasn't a crystal ball or any kind of magic worked here. There was no scientific logarithmic reason why we struck the boundary where it's at, other than, number one, we needed at least 300 feet for our contiguity. We didn't want to run up the middle of a block, and the next natural boundary for this ended up being North Atlantic Avenue. The other reason why we didn't make it any larger than it is, just yet, or right now, is because the taxing bodies preferred that we try this in a limited area first without including a lot more of the community. And when I explain to you how TIF works here in a moment, that'll become more clear as to why their preference was that we not make it any larger than it is. Okay, so we're trying to work with our taxing district partners in this development effort, and we're trying to include what we thought we needed right now in order to kind of get this program established and working. There may be opportunities in the future to amend this area further and add some additional properties, but it would be a little pointless at this juncture because we don't have a lot of money in the fund yet to be able to work with a bigger area. So once it begins generating more funds and we have a program that is working, then the village may, I don't know, but it may consider looking at another subsequent amendment later on. So,
If I may, Mr. Klein, just say that the village board is very wanting to put together a comprehensive plan, all-encompassing for our neighborhoods. We want to invest in our neighborhoods and continue to improve our neighborhoods. So we're embarking on this plan, which will be multifaceted, and we're also going to be applying for a grant, a DCO grant of $500,000 that would help improve property. So this is just one tool in what I would describe as a pilot program to see what works and what doesn't work. So that's why we're starting small, seeing what's going to work here. But the housing grant, if we're successful in getting that, would be village-wide.
right. Right. So part of the experiment here will be to see to what extent the housing grant on its own inspires development, and then we can compare that with a portion of the housing grant with these other tools to see what kind of a difference it makes. And, you know, whatever works is what the village is going to want to try to use in the future if it needs to in order to help the rest of the community to the extent it can. So I'm going to come back to your question again here in a moment. If I can segue over into the third page of your handout that we've provided to you. Don, did you get one? Do you? So on the third page of this handout, there is a colorful chart at the top that says, how does TIF work? And at the bottom, there is an example of a real estate tax bill. Let me start with the picture. And I will try to relieve the board's concern. They know how windy I can get on my explanation of how TIF works. I'll keep it brief because I know we all got a ball game we want to go watch here in a little bit probably, so I'll try not to take too long. So when you look at the diagram at the top, as I mentioned earlier, when a TIF district is established, when it's created, by law, the longest it can be created for is 23 years. The village will be able to collect TIF funds for the 23 years with the last money being paid to the village in the 24th year. Because of that, again, assessments occur in 1 year, and then it's the following calendar year when taxes are actually paid, when they're collected and paid. That's how it works in Illinois. The reason for the 23 years will become clearer here in a moment, but the reason for the time is that when we work on projects and we're trying to make substantial improvements to property, some of these projects will cost tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to do, and it can take several years to kind of amortize out the repayment or the incentives that are necessary through this program to make it work. So that's basically why we need the 20-year period in order for this to work well. You see the rectangle at the bottom, the black rectangle, it says project areas base, EAV. The EAV means the equalized assessed valuation. So when you look at a real estate tax bill, and here in Peoria County, they will have, you look down at the right-hand corner of the tax bill sample that I've given you, and in this sample it says the fair property value, the fair market property value of this example is $891,000. And when it says total value, it's talking about what its assessed value is, what the county looks at. What portion of that $891,000 does the county look at for real estate tax purposes? And here in Illinois, that's typically about 33 1/3 of the fair market value for most properties. This happens to be a commercial property. And so when you follow that down, then it's got a multiplier. We won't get into multipliers, but that's the state's way of trying to even out the real estate tax burden across all the counties in Illinois. And here the multiplier was 1, so it makes no change or difference in this property's value. So the assessed value is $296,990. And what happens then is that that net taxable value is multiplied by the current total real estate tax rate, which is the tax rates of all of the applicable or affected taxing districts, which you see listed over to the left on that tax bill: the county, the soil and water, the community college, the airport, and so forth. All of them, with the exception of Peoria Heights TIF District 2, all of them have a real estate tax rate. Okay? That's where, in this example, the 9.63383% rate comes from, is the summation of all of those taxing bodies' individual property tax rates, because the county has determined, based on the money that the county is requesting for its operations for this year, to calculate based on the value of the property. The county determines what the rate should be. So if the value of the property is $296,000, that's the value that we have to work with in this case. The county treasurer then figures out that it's going to take a rate of 9.6% in order to get, for example, the school district, it's $16,500 that it needs. Okay? So, go back to the chart at the top. That black rectangle, all right, represents what's known as the base equalized assessed value. That means what was the taxable value, the value that the county uses to determine real estate taxes immediately prior to when the TIF district was established. So for TIF district number 2, it was created February or March of 2015. So the most current assessed value at that time was for the prior year, was for the tax year 15 payable in calendar year 16, because we hadn't gotten to a new tax bill yet. Those don't come out until later in the year, right? So whatever the value of this property was in 2015 is what that black rectangle represents, and that black rectangle is a hard number. It's called the base value because at the time the TIF is created, that portion of the value on that property is preserved for the life of the TIF district to make sure that all of the taxing bodies can continue to levy against, can ask for money each year through their property taxes based on that value, and continue to receive revenue that they had been accustomed to receiving in the past. Any increase in assessed valuation over and above that base value during the life of the TIF district, if somebody builds on to their building, if there's any kind of improvements made that increases the value of the property, that incremental increase in value over and above what the original value was is called the TIF incremental assessment. It's the portion of the tax bill then that the county says, well, that increase occurred sometime after 2015, okay? And the increase that resulted then, multiplied by the same real estate tax rate that everyone is paying here, results in a new portion of the real estate tax bill. And in this example, if you look down here, and you see where we've highlighted Peoria Heights TIF District 2 for this property, the portion of the tax bill, the money that this property owner paid, was $956 of the total $28,000 tax bill. $956 of it was accounted for separately by the county and provided to the village and deposited to the village's TIF fund. Okay, and that $956 means that during that tax year, there had been some increase in the value of that property that occurred over and above what it originally was valued at before the TIF district. And that times the tax rate that applies everywhere here meant that the TIF portion of that $28,000 tax bill was $956. It's reallocated. $956 is merely reallocated out of the total tax bill that this taxpayer is paying that goes then into the TIF fund. And that's the orange part of the graph up here at the top, the new money that's generated. And that new money then can be used for paying for public infrastructure, or in some cases it may be used to reimburse certain costs that a private developer, investor in a property makes to their property to reimburse them for costs that they've incurred for the project, like renovations to a building, or getting a site ready to build a new building on it, or acquiring property for a new business to locate here, are all examples of kinds of things that the village then has the authority to be able to use that $956 in some productive way to cause or to help create development to occur within the boundary, within the TIF district area that's been designated. So that money needs to be used within that TIF district, or a portion of it could be used in an adjacent contiguous area. When the TIF district then is finished, when it's run its course, with the 24th year payable forward then, 24th year payable 25th year, then all of the new value that's been stimulated through the TIF program can then be available to all the taxing bodies to levy against at that time, and the TIF ends, the TIF goes away. So the TIF is just a tool. It's a financial tool that the village can use to try to encourage someone to do something more here, or to do something at all here that they wouldn't have otherwise been likely to do. This is how, in TIF District 1, the Trefsker's Bakery was located here. This is how the old gas station on the corner of 4500 North Prospect was removed and replaced with what you see there today. TIF was used to stimulate the development of the apartment building on Duryea. And it has already helped facilitate the relocation of the Other Dog restaurant that was located behind Subway, is now locating down in the plaza, down in TIF 2, Heights Landing Plaza. There are other things that are occurring that are being used in that way. TIF isn't intended to reimburse anybody's costs entirely for a project. It's intended to try to help, to the extent that if we can lower the risk by reimbursing some of these costs to an investor, they're more likely to want to invest here than go somewhere else. So we're trying to use TIF and business development districts to level the playing field and encourage more development to occur for your community. Let me start over here and then I'll...
I have two questions.
Yes, sir.
Were the time limits for the length of the TIFs synchronized or expired at the same time? Between the addition we're adding here, the one that is finished, number 2?
The amendment will not change the duration of the TIF district. It's still on the same schedule. We're just adding property to it.
Second question is, how much is the estimated revenue to be raised? I'm sure it's just an estimate, but do you have some idea what the potential revenue increase could be? How much money will the TIF raise? I know what period.
In the amended area, we've provided for, in the amended plan, some additional projects that relate to the yellow boundary area. Now, the original TIF district, I've got the plan, we could talk about that. That would be another set of projects and costs. But just for the amended area, we're looking at, various kinds of commercial development that could include commercial, retail, perhaps a motel, hotel project, another restaurant or two, and then we've got these residential rehab projects in here. And over the remaining life of the TIF district, again, it is an estimate. If everything worked the way it should, we don't have any more economic recessions, and people want to continue to invest here, we're looking at total projected investment of just a little over $18 million of new private investment. The projected real estate tax increment, the orange part that would relate to the graph here, that we've estimated would be somewhere around $11 million. And of that $11 million, we've estimated there would be probably not less than $5.4 million of anticipated TIF-eligible project costs that would be needed in order to stimulate that type of growth to occur. The remaining increment that's generated that isn't necessarily obligated in this amendment would overlap and be obligated in the original plan, because there's additional costs and projects that are in the plan, the original plan. The original plan, for example, included $7.1 million of public project costs, and we're adding $6 million by this amendment. So that's for streets, sanitary, the sidewalks, the water, the alleys, street lights, public facility, any kind of public type of infrastructure improvements would be within that $13.1 million total that will be included in this plan once it's amended. On the private side, we had $5.3 million of private redevelopment costs already anticipated in the original TIF area, and we've added another 5.4, so it's 10.7 million additional private costs that we anticipate in TIF 2. So these are ambitious numbers, but it's a 20-year period, and it's not all going to happen at once. There's no guarantee it'll all happen. But the TIF Act requires that the village not only make its findings available in the plan, but also that it anticipates what it will use this money for if it's able to generate it, and that's what these numbers represent. I'll come back. There's a question over here if I'm...
I just wanted to go back to the beginning when you talked about where Subway was going to be going. We're expanding the TIF, so...
Yes, with regard to Subway?
Right. Now, is it going on the south side of the music places? Is it going over the resale shop?
Yep. Well, that site plan has changed a few times, and I don't know that it's been finalized yet, has it?
It's changed a couple times, but the location would be Warren and Monroe, kind of where the Helping Hands, that plaza is right. With the first round through zoning, they had a few changes. They came back through and repositioned the building where it'd be parallel to War Drive, but the location's the same as of today's date. So,
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep. Yes, ma'am, you have a question?
My question is the TIF drawing on the village site expired and no longer valid?
Is the TIF, I'm sorry,
That drawing, the map, where you go to a village site that shows the parts of the houses that are in the TIF program?
Website update. I'm checking.
It looks like it might not be valid anymore.
I'm not sure I understand the question.
She's checking the website, Steve, to see if it is up to date and current, because I know at one time they showed that each TIF district individually, so it looks like they
Oh, I
weren't
see.
all contiguous, but she's checking right now.
You mean on the village's website?
This, now yes, we haven't yet voted on that, so it wouldn't show on the website that these tips were contiguous because that's what this hearing is about.
Yeah.
Eliminate all of that.
The maps will be updated.
Yeah.
They will be updated, and
Individuals on there, Stephanie?
She's checking as fast as she can. She didn't have anything in the site.
And those individual maps, if you want hard copy, those are available here at the village too. Anytime you want a copy of that.
I was just wondering if maybe it's like a draw anymore.
If which?
But actually, it isn't all draw anymore, because it looks like it's moving away from that area.
Well, this is a completely different area than up here. This area up here that includes Tower Park, and Glen Avenue going west to the, is it the Kiwanis Park or the Lions Park? Basically, at that point, that's TIF District Number 3. It's a different area, but it's still, yes, it's in effect. It is, yes. We're not making any changes to that. Yeah. Now, this is all focused on down on War Memorial Drive and then north on Prospect up to Lake Street. That's.
I don't know if this was taking a new course or.
No, it doesn't affect TIF 3 or TIF 1 or anything that the village is doing uptown here. Any other questions or comments? Or?
Well, I just wanted to correct you on that. It actually goes past Lake Avenue all the way to Scioto, not just to Lake Avenue.
I use the term loosely, yes. From the southernmost boundary of TIF 1 is Lake Avenue. That's, I'm sorry, is what I had in my head. But to make TIF 2 contiguous with TIF 1, it went to Lake Avenue, and then it took property on up to the, basically what would be the alley right away north of Scioto. Okay, yes, that's what the map reflects.
Steve, would you explain how, if this is passed by the board, a homeowner might go about seeking money to improve their property? How would that look?
Sure. So there's a process for everything, right? It is not an automatic. It's not something that is, because you're in the TIF district, that you're entitled to anything. It's not an entitlement program. You need to have a project. You need to come to the village with some kind of improvement that you're proposing to make to your property, and there'll be an application. We are proud of the fact that we are not the city of Chicago here, where we don't have a 50-page application for you to fill out in that regard. We have a very succinct, direct, about 3 or 4 pages that we ask you to go through, tell us about your project, where your property is at, and what you're proposing to do, so that we can make some estimated guesses as to the effect it may have on your property after the improvements are completed. And we'll look at how much your tax bill is likely to increase because of it. Now, keep in mind, the village has nothing to do whatsoever with determining the value of your property or what your real estate taxes are. That's all county. County does that. But we will help you try to get as close as possible to estimating what the effect of your improvement may be, and then to what extent TIF funds might be applicable or available to assist you. And so that usually requires, a conversation or two, and we look at some numbers and we try to figure out what may work. Typically, if the project is substantial enough, if you were adding on to your property where you were going to add, 1,000 square feet or something to your home, and it's going to significantly increase the assessed value of your property, when you have a chance and you think about this graph some more and how the TIF works, then you'll understand that it takes some kind of increase in the property's value to create the new money for the village to have access to it, to be able to reimburse any of it back to the project. For projects that cannot on their own do that, that's where we're talking about devising some type of a matching grant, forgivable loan, or some type of a program that would use TIF and or Business Development District funds to be able to supplement that property's ability to make those improvements. That's usually the second pass on the analysis. The first one is, let's look at what you want to do, see to what extent it may increase the value of the property. Can the property itself generate some new TIF funds that the village could reimburse back to you to help reduce your costs? And if that doesn't work, then we would look at Plan B, which would be a supplementary type of program that the village, provided it can fund it, because it's not money that falls from the sky. I mean, it takes a little bit of time for the TIF fund and for the business district fund to generate some dollars for the city to work, the village to work with. And I would say the earliest that the village would have funds for a program like this, based only on the TIF 2 and the Business District 2 funds, is probably going to be sometime next spring, at the very earliest, that there would be funds generated by these of any substantial amount to really be able to start doing these things. But that doesn't mean that you have to wait until May to come talk to the village. If you have plans, I encourage you to talk to them, and we'll go through the process with you up here, and then we'll go back to them.
Who's going to control that? Is there going to be a separate board, or is it going to be the village board that determines what projects are going to be ongoing?
So
What decisions are going to be made? If I want to make, improvements to my property, add a bedroom or whatever, and if there's a piece of crap across the street, is that going to determine whether or not I get a chance to get any of these funds?
So the village,
It's all based on where my property line is going to be, and the neighbors,
irrespective of what's next door to you or across the street from you, to the extent that you want to reinvest in your property, that's your decision. No, the village isn't going to tell you that these programs are not available to you on the merits of what's next door. Okay? That's safe to say?
Yes.
The village board of trustees, as is in the case of every municipality in Illinois, has the sole authority to establish a TIF area and to administer it, to use it. So there's no other body that has legislative authority over the village to decide how they use the TIF funds, other than the use of the funds have to comply with the plan that they prepared, and it has to comply with the law. It has to be compliant with the TIF Act. And that's partly what we help the village make sure they are compliant.
So I think there are several goals we want to achieve here. One, the current TIF districts in the downtown area are doing very well. The Business Development District has funds, and it's doing very well. This will allow these two districts to function together. We think it'll not only help the War Memorial Drive corridor and the business district there to continue to grow, but also, as I mentioned earlier, one of the most important things, if not the most important thing to this village board, is our neighborhoods. So this will allow us to take money from the commercial development and invest it in neighborhoods, and that could be a whole lot of things. So that's what we're trying to achieve here.
Well, and thank you. That's a great point. And also, keep in mind that the village has really done a remarkable job. It's been a feat for them to bring their budget into balance and with a bit of a surplus now, as I understand. And so if the TIF area is successful and it generates funds with which then within that boundary projects can be undertaken with the assistance of the TIF funds, it is possible and perhaps likely then that the village would have the ability to redirect or reallocate some other budget money that it would have otherwise used within the TIF area for street improvements and other public projects outside the TIF district that it wouldn't have otherwise had. So if we focus the TIF funds in the TIF area, typically it will free up other dollars in other funds of the village that it can use to make public improvements elsewhere that it would have otherwise had to spread across the whole area. But we're focusing on these redevelopment project areas by trying to drill down and use the TIF funds in those boundary areas, which then hopefully will free up some dollars to do other things for the village. Okay.
Okay, I have that question for you, sir. I just wanted to know, since it was mentioned in the last TIF meeting that I was at, that starting sometime around October, we could pull those applications. And if this program did go through, then we'd start looking at those applications sometime in the next future here. When are these applications going to be available?
So,
Are they going to be available anytime soon?
so you probably attended the public meeting in August. And at that public meeting, we made many of the same remarks I've made tonight with regard to creation of the program. We can't create the program and make available an application for a program that doesn't exist, and we can't create the program until we have the tool in place to be able to do that. Otherwise, we'd be providing you with applications that the village would have no authority to follow through on. So we have to get the amendment completed. The earliest that the amendment can be completed will be at the board's meeting on November the 5th. And so sometime subsequent to November 5th, we would anticipate that we will begin to have available applications for people to begin to use. There is already a kind of a standardized generic TIF application that once your property is included in the TIF area, you can use that now. They already have an application. It's just that they can't offer it to you until your property is included in the area. Once the TIF district is amended, and we've already established the business district in that area, those tools are in place, then we will begin concentrating. I'll work with Chief Sutton, the mayor, and the board to try to craft this program, this housing redevelopment program, and try to anticipate then when it can be offered, when it can be effective. And as I said a few moments ago, it's probably not going to be much before next spring, if early summer, before there's funds available in either account, the business district or the TIF 2 fund, to be able to offer any kind of matching funds or low-interest loans or those types of things. But once your project is included, the amendment is done, after November 5th, you can come up here and, or they'll send it to you online or on by email, an application you can fill out, and we'll go through the analysis with you. If you're going to add on to your property, and if it's substantial enough, it'll generate some new TIF dollars, and we can enter into an agreement with you to help you. We can do that on a case-by-case basis at that time. You don't have to wait for the special program to apply.
No, we don't want anyone to wait. You know,
No.
our door is always open, and all the trustees and myself and Chief Sutton, we're always available by phone or email. Primarily tonight, we're here to take comment and questions about the TIF district itself, but I want you to know that this is, again, a high priority, and several of the trustees are currently working on housing and housing issues, everything from looking at maybe establishing some neighborhood associations, doing some neighborhood newsletters, and incidentally, we just had our second neighborhood meeting. We're going to have a third neighborhood meeting, so we're really trying to go out into all the neighborhoods and listen to all of you of what you want. So this is, we're on a tour to hear from all of the neighbors, but again, we're just starting to roll all of this out.
Mayor, I got a question, if I may.
Okay.
So we're not going to know what the content of a residential program is until after we've approved the amendment?
Steve, you'd be best to take that question, but yes, that's the way I think it's going to, the program will.
Right.
We have to have the TIF and the
Business
everything in
district
place.
and the TIF need to be in place and applicable to this area before we can offer a program. We can start talking about the mechanics of the program anytime, okay, anytime you'd like. But we don't want to waste your time until we are certain that the amendment is completed and available.
One of the things that make this so beneficial, I think, especially the boundaries, is that it does include residential properties. But if we don't have a plan in place to gauge how beneficial it's going to be for these residents.
All I can tell you is that the plan that you put together for this housing program will be better than the one you have now.
And you raised a good point, Trustee Weisenberg. A lot of this is new ground, because I think we're breaking ground here to use TIF money to help neighborhoods and residential areas, so there may not be a lot of history or communities we can look to. I mean, there's plenty of examples throughout the state of Illinois for commercial TIF districts, and a TIF district is a TIF district, but one of our goals, as stated, is to help these neighborhoods. So I think we're all going to have to collaborate as a board and maybe hold a special meeting or two amongst ourselves to talk about what that may look like. So I know neighborhoods are a special concern of yours, so I'd be interested in what you're thinking.
Right, and what I don't want to do is I don't want to sell grand plans to the residents included in this TIF district and then nothing materialize. that's beneficial to them.
It's not and the thing that we need to keep in mind is that it's not going to increase anyone's taxes, so there's no negative consequence for these properties to be included in the TIF area, okay? We're creating the TIF area to try to establish a mechanism to make something more happen than would otherwise. If you want examples, we can give you plenty of examples. You could go up the road to Farmington, Illinois, which is really cleaning everybody's clock right now on neighborhood redevelopment programs. We set that one up with them. You could call the mayor or call the city administrator and talk about how that's worked. I can tell you that about 2 years ago, they had $50,000 that they set aside for a matching grant program for neighborhood residential redevelopment. They created the program, I believe it was in April, and by the end of May, they had $52,000 worth of applications. So it works. And they've had to reallocate additional funds to make it work. What's different here is that we can not only perhaps do that at some point. Again, keep in mind, we've got to let some money accumulate in the fund. We've got to get money in the fund to make that mechanism work. But what's different here is that you will also have the benefit of being able to use the business development district in tandem with it. And that's where the mayor is exactly correct, that I'm not aware of any program anywhere that has combined forces with TIF and business development districts to encourage the availability of additional housing accommodations or the improvement of residential areas. You'd be cutting some new territory using it.
Yeah, and so again, this is multifaceted. So I see this as generating some money where we can make some improvements in lighting, sidewalks, infrastructure, and if we're successful with the DCO grant, that could be up to $50,000 grant per property. So someone could put in a new furnace, new siding, new roof, cosmetic improvements. So I see it, I look at this as a toolbox, and this is one tool that's going to be in the toolbox with many tools.
Are you looking at this from like a timing perspective?
No, what I would like to see is like maybe a draft proposal for a residential program prior to voting on including all these residents in a TIF district. Because when we say there's no negative impact of including these, I don't want to call it negative, but that's maybe not entirely accurate, because the increased value that would go into public works, into the village, is then now taken into the TIF district. So as development increases, those other taxing bodies have to do more with less.
Well, we were talking about the residents. There's no negative impact on the residents by having their property included in the TIF area, because they're not paying a larger tax bill because of the TIF. And this is the reason, too, why you have intergovernmental agreements with the school, and we work with the other taxing bodies.
No, I understand that the residents aren't going to be charged more, but if the taxing bodies that serve these residents are doing more with less, that does impact them.
The problem is that they're doing more with less now, because if you talk to the superintendent of schools, he will tell you that their assessed valuation district-wide has not been increasing at a rate that is sufficient for them to even...
We have a flat EAV.
We have a flat assessment. So we're starting from flat or negative ground already. So it can only get better.
So in a way, this is trying to restart or kickstart the market. But I would ask you if you would be willing, would you work with Trustee Kazam to try and get some suggestions to the board? Is that?
Absolutely.
Is that okay, Trustee?
Yeah.
I think it's a great point. And we don't want to overpromise and underperform. That's a term that I use a lot. But for example, on our commercial, on our business TIFs that we have entered into, those agreements, we have made the school district get whole, close to whole, on those agreements. And those are all project-driven agreements that the Heights historically has entered into. So I would expect that, I would hope that if we enter into any residential agreements, that we would make the school district whole on that as well.
It's a relative term, but you're providing assistance to the school district. I wouldn't use the word whole, but the school district is getting a substantial share of the increment that's being generated, yes. but the school district has a vested interest in your success in trying to attract more population and more commercial development to occur here. You need population. I know we've got busy corridors, you got high traffic counts. You can't rely solely on that for every business. These businesses up here and along War Memorial, they rely on local purchases as well. So in order to have a thriving commercial sector that's growing, you need to be able to bring population with it to the extent that you want more people here to support and raise that threshold so that more commercial entrepreneurs and businesses will want to be here. They'll recognize there's a market. They don't want to rely on just everybody driving in from another county. We need to continue to try to keep the people we have and provide some alternatives for people to want to move here and live here. And that's what we're trying to accomplish here.
Can I just add one more thing there, Mayor? You know, I'm not trying to belittle what you're doing, but the fact is, I own a house with about 1,100 so odd square feet. If I'm going to double the size of the house, and that's not awesome, I'm going to need that grant because last time I checked, I don't know, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 would just about cover that and all the substandardness. So what we're trying to do here is I'm trying to figure out how this is going to long-term help my situation, but not only my situation, but everybody around me. Because whether we have a TIF or we don't have a TIF, that's all great. But like you said, you're not going to make Peoria Heights any bigger. You're not going to build land into the river. So if we're going to make investments to double the size of our houses or add on to our houses or upgrade facilities at our houses to make it possible to bring in more family or have more kids or whatever like that without blowing the circuit breakers out of the place, we need some sort of a plan in place that we can actually reach out, grab on and say, great coach, I believe in what you're doing, but we need to have an idea whether we need a seat at the Super Bowl or we need to just cash the whole thing in and go home and wait till next year. I appreciate your time.
No, thank you, and those are good comments, and we're taking notes, and everyone's listening, and we appreciate you saying that. Yes, ma'am. Steve, another question there?
My question is, does the village at this time have any low-interest home assistance loan? Is there anything in place in the village currently where you assist homeowners with any improvements or anything where they can apply for low-interest loans or ramps or anything for their homes? Is there anything in place now?
No.
Nothing?
No, ma'am.
Now, to amend the TIF, if I'm understanding this correctly, our residences, all of that was taken into consideration, the condition of the neighborhoods and all of that. So in that application process and doing all of that study, those homeowners, there's no incentive included in that application for those homeowners in residential areas. Are you understanding this?
There is actually in the plan, and I recited the fact that there's residential redevelopment that's provided for, anticipated in this plan that the village will undertake. If it wasn't in the plan, the village wouldn't be able to use TIF to do it.
That's exactly what
Okay, so it's in the plan to satisfy and be compliant with what the law requires the village to do in order to get the TIF district created or amended in this case. It's up to the board ultimately to decide the actual parameters and the mechanics of the type of program that the village can or wishes to offer. And that's what we're talking about will be the next step, is that we need to determine what those specifics are for that program and make it available as soon as we can. I'm just telling you, there's not enough money in the fund at the beginning of these programs. If you're planning on, if you have something you have to do this winter, you know, it's unlikely that there's going to be any assistance available. But if it's something that you anticipate undertaking perhaps next summer or next fall, then yeah, we hope to have money populated in these funds to some usable extent that we can be able to offer these things.
I understand that.
But we can't provide you an application for a program for which we don't have the authority to offer. So once the TIF is amended and the area is created, then we can really bear down with those that want to be involved and create the mechanics for that and make it happen. It doesn't take very long to
Yeah,
do that.
this is a journey, and we're going to get there, but this is one step along the way, so.
We had another question, I think, one more.
I just wanted to ask, I know there's a lot of properties in the Heights and in this particular area that are either vacant, they're repos. Is there any incentive for people to be able to apply to even purchase some of these properties? To make them on a property or?
That's another challenge we're acutely aware of, that there are a lot of people who cycle in and out of the village due to a high level of rental properties. And we have some, that's not to say we don't have some fantastic renters who have lived here a long time, but we do know people come in and out of a lot of these rental properties, which is another thing that we put in place earlier this year, was a landlord registration ordinance. We also, we have a lot of vacant land, and we have a lot of empty houses. So addressing all those, again, so it's a process of inventorying where those houses are. The village currently has 6 parcels of land that we have out for requests for proposals to redevelop that land. So we've had a high level of interest from a lot of realtors and developers to bid on those parcels. So that's a good thing that's occurring as well. But we are aware of what you bring up, ma'am, and we're addressing that too. So again, as I said, it's multifaceted all over the village.
Once the property's in the TIF area, if you got a vacant lot next door and you would like to purchase that lot and build a new home on it, get up here and ask for an application, because that type of activity is something that the TIF can help with, okay?
How about if it's not a vacant property, it's a house?
Then the demolition costs can be eligible expenses.
That demolition?
Yes, if you're going to replace it with another home, then that could be a possibility as well.
I was just thinking about renovating it and making it more desirable for the neighborhood.
The renovation costs are eligible types of expenses. You're not going to see as big of an increase in the assessed valuation on a renovation of a house as you will for a larger remodeling or an expansion of the property or something new. But that's why we have to do the math. We have to go through the process and try to figure out what it might be able to accomplish.
So over the summer,
the village is willing to try to help you figure it out.
over the summer, we did have a gentleman here in town. His name is Chuck Marone. He runs a company called Strong Towns, and we talked for a day on one of these topics, and one of the things that he suggested was not that you just do a little bit here and a little bit there, but that you identify some blocks and you get 5 or 6 properties in that block and really attack it from that angle. That was his recommendation. I know, Trustee Kazam, you were there. You could probably say it better than I, but I think you heard him.
Yes, absolutely. And through a lot of these tools and using that strategy, I think it can be very successful in our community.
Yes.
In order to be approved for financing, are there any rules or requirements in place that determine who actually does the work? Like, for instance, we have a rental property that we own on Vincent, and it needs a new roof, and we've done that for a while, and my husband was just going to replace it himself and with some friends, partly because it saves money that way instead of hiring a company, but also because he's a perfectionist and believes if you want something done right, you got to do it yourself. And so he doesn't even want to hire outside. So that's my question. If we were to do work ourselves, do we still qualify for reimbursement or grant money? Or
You may qualify for some reimbursement on the materials. Okay? If you're doing the work yourself, that is not regarded as a TIF-eligible expense. There are some rare exceptions, like if your husband is a contractor, if he does that for a living and could produce an invoice commensurate with what he would charge someone else to do the work, then there might be some exceptions. But the rule of thumb is that sweat equity, a person's own labor, is not a TIF-eligible expense, but we could help with the material.
that wasn't my question about sweat equity. It was just, if there was some kind of, if we would still even be able to qualify for some kind of materials or whatever. So I just know for something like that, he was not going to hire somebody.
Let me leave you with this thought. It never hurts to ask, okay? No one's going to be offended by your asking. And what we will do is use these tools as much as possible that the law will allow us to use them. And if we can't, for some reason, we'll explain why. But we want to try to encourage these types of things to happen. I missed somebody over here at another...
Will information be put on the site?
The website?
When funding is available, and a list of examples of what and how and all that, so people can know.
I would anticipate that it would, so, right? Yes. Did you?
How long would residents have to pay back the loan?
Well, if we can work it the way we hope to, they won't all have to be paid back. Because if you're making improvements to the property and it increases the value, that means that your tax bill goes up because you invested in it. If the tax bill goes up, the village receives a portion of that in the TIF fund. So if your property is capable of doing that, then that may reduce or modify any repayment that you may have to make on a loan. So there's a number of different types of approaches that we can use, but the board has to have an opportunity to try to determine how much money it may want to earmark or allocate for this type of activity. And then we'll have to figure out, looking at the number of properties that could potentially request this type of assistance, what kind of meaningful help can we offer, can we create? And so we appreciate your patience. If you'll bear with us, I think something good is coming. We've just got to get these things in place and have an opportunity to put it together. And I'm heartened to see that there's a number of people that are interested in the program. They would like to take advantage of it, and that's really good testimony for the village board, the ones that are here, to be able to see and hear, because taking the point that was made earlier, we don't want to create something just speculatively that we don't know whether it's going to work or not. It's the business that I'm in. It's what I do. I've done this hundreds of times, and I can tell you I have pretty high confidence it's going to work because I can cite other communities where the same thing has been done. But at the same time, every town is unique, and we want to do what Peoria Heights needs to do. Yes?
One other question. You said the TIF 2 initially, is that right? Let me take my glasses off. There were 98, I guess, parcels or whatever?
Yes.
And then with the amendment, we have an additional 290.
Yes.
How many of the 290, if I'm determining these are sites or properties, how many of those would be residential?
I would say, I don't have that number with me, but I would say that it's probably in the 60% range. Close to 2/3, I would say, is probably a residential property.
Is there anywhere that we can be made privy to the proposed business ideas, like Subway, and McDonald's? Is there somewhere
numbers that we can go? I mean, I don't think it's about other fees.
So the projects as they occur, and we didn't talk about this very much, but anytime that there's any TIF funds made available to a private individual or a company, has to be approved by the board by ordinance in a written agreement. Anything that's been approved by the board is public information, and they can share with you the kinds of things that they've already done. In fact, there's an annual report that's prepared every fiscal year, and we're in the process of getting a new one ready that will list out the projects that have been undertaken in each of these TIF districts, and it gives a brief description of what they are and the amount of money that's been incentivized using TIF for each of those projects. So it's all very transparent and available to you once those projects have been completed. Just in the same way that if you came to the village and asking for assistance on your property and shared with us confidentially your information about what you want to do, we can't share that information when it's in a preliminary stage with Subway or anybody else that we're trying to figure out how to make it work, because there are no agreements yet. When the amendment process began, there were a couple of things approved by the village board called an inducement resolution. The inducement resolution was not an agreement. It was a non-binding resolution that the board approved for the Subway project and one for McDonald's that said if they would proceed with the projects that they are talking about, that the village would make a good faith effort to include those sites in the TIF district, with the idea that once the amendment is completed, we could come back and talk with them again about negotiating a redevelopment agreement. And every agreement can be different. They do not all have to be the same. I will say that if the village creates some type of a home improvement program using TIF and/or business district funds, it will have, at that point, it would have its own application form unique to that program, because if you're applying for that particular program, that whether it's a loan or a grant or whatever combination of that, everybody's going to be treated the same, okay? But if you have a project you want to come and talk to the village anytime that would be beyond the scope of what that program offers, you can do that as well. It's just that you would then have, if they proceed with it, you would have a separate agreement of your own. You would have a separate deal with the village depending on the merits of your own project.
And so what we don't want to create is a very cumbersome
Right.
process where it's a burden on people. So I would hope that when we get to that point, we create something that's very simple. I could see us maybe working with local banks. Someone might need some of their own financing. They might need TIF financing, but probably bringing on a point person who would oversee this process. So.
Yeah, and the application would, I mean, it's going to be different, but it wouldn't be drastically unlike the kind of application the village already uses for Business District Number 1 for the grant program that you offer. It has limited incentives available based on certain conditions. Everyone is treated the same, and the application itself is approved by ordinance, or the program's approved by ordinance, and then each application, once it's gone through the analysis, comes to the board for approval again, but it's a pretty streamlined process. I would envision the home redevelopment project, neighborhood project, would work much the same. West Peoria is another community that has done a really great job of offering matching grants to residential homeowner projects, so they've done dozens of them over there too.
I just have a question for you. If you go to the TIF 2 where you stop at London Avenue down by Ford Drive, and if I bought the 550 lots on Wilson, how hard would it be for that to become part of the TIF?
To do another amendment?
Yeah, I mean, what's the process of that? I'm not saying I'm buying the lots, but if somebody wanted to purchase those empty lots, they've been there empty for years now. Would that be a very hard process to get into the TIF to borrow and build it?
It's not necessarily a difficult process. It's one that's going to require them to show us what the project is.
Right.
What are they going to do, and will it justify making another change or another amendment to this? And if you're adding 1 square inch of area to an existing TIF district, we go through this whole process again.
Yeah.
Right?
That's what I was-
Someone had asked me that.
Well, but we hope it works, and we're confident it's going to work. So what the next step would be? Would it be extending TIF districts? We just don't know yet, but that, Mike, that's a good question, and we certainly want to, whether it's through this process or another one, we want to encourage people to look at building homes in the village, affordable homes.
There's layers of analysis that has to be done there, though, to make sure that it's worthwhile for the project, that it's worthwhile for the village to do the amendment, and that it's not creating a problem for other taxing districts, because those are all parts of the equation that we take into account here.
Is there any other business come before the public hearing? Yes, go ahead, Ms. Stella.
I'd like to commend the board and the administration for what you're doing. Nothing happens if you don't try, and you people have done a great job.
Thank you, Gary. Appreciate you being here tonight. So once again, any other business? Any other business? For the last time, any other business? Public hearing's adjourned. I want to thank you all for being here, and please email us, call us. We want to continue to get your input.